6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Windsor Castle with a clarity that seemed to reflect the transparency that had been restored to the ancient institution. The sensational trial of Queen Camilla and her co-conspirators had concluded just 2 weeks earlier with convictions on all major charges, and the castle was finally beginning to return to something resembling normal operation. Princess Charlotte walked alongside Sergeant Major Morrison through corridors that had been thoroughly swept and secured, but which now carried the weight of recent history rather than hidden secrets. The young princess moved with a confidence that had been earned through facing extraordinary circumstances, though she remained the thoughtful, curious child she had always been. "Sergeant Major," she said as they passed the entrance to the south wing, which had been completely renovated following the investigation, "do you think Granny Camilla really understood how much she was hurting our family and the country?" Morrison had grown to appreciate these philosophical conversations that Charlotte initiated during their morning walks. The events of the previous year had matured her in ways that were both remarkable and somewhat heartbreaking for those who understood how much innocence she had been forced to surrender. "I think, Your Highness, that people sometimes convince themselves that wrong actions are justified if they believe the reasons are important enough. But that doesn't make the actions right, and it doesn't excuse the harm they cause to others." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. The trial had revealed the full extent of the conspiracy, a 3-year operation that had succeeded in stealing and selling artifacts worth over £200 million, with Queen Camilla receiving payments totaling nearly £15 million in Swiss bank accounts. The international criminal network she had worked with specialized in infiltrating cultural institutions worldwide, using sophisticated forgeries to mask their thefts. "I feel sorry for her sometimes," Charlotte admitted. "Even though what she did was very wrong, I remember when she would read me stories and help me with my writing. It's hard to understand how someone can be kind in some ways and so dishonest in others." Morrison was continually impressed by Charlotte's ability to hold complex emotions about the situation. Rather than viewing Queen Camilla as purely evil, she recognized the complicated nature of human behavior while maintaining clarity about the moral issues involved. As they approached the library, where Charlotte would spend her morning in tutoring sessions, Morrison reflected on how much had changed since that frightening day in the art studio. The investigation had ultimately revealed connections to similar thefts at major museums across Europe, leading to arrests in 6 countries and the recovery of stolen artifacts worth over £500 million. Charlotte's testimony, delivered via secure video link to protect her from media attention, had been praised by legal experts as remarkably precise and credible. Her ability to recall specific details and conversations had provided crucial evidence that corroborated financial records and intercepted communications. "Your Highness," Morrison said as they paused outside the library, "I received word yesterday that the final pieces from the stolen collection have been authenticated and returned. The last of Queen Victoria's jewelry was recovered from a private collector in Monaco who claimed he had purchased it legitimately." Charlotte's face brightened with genuine pleasure. "That's wonderful news. I've been worried about those pieces particularly, they seem so personal, not just valuable but full of history and memories." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Detective Chief Inspector Matthews, who had maintained regular contact with the family throughout the legal proceedings. Her presence was no longer alarming, but rather reassuring, a sign that the investigation had been thorough and that justice had been properly served. "Good morning, Princess Charlotte," Sergeant Major Morrison, DCI Matthews said with the informal warmth that had developed over months of working together. "I wanted to update you on some final developments from the international investigation." Charlotte gestured toward the comfortable seating area near the library entrance. "Please, Inspector Matthews, tell us what you've learned." DCI Matthews settled into one of the ornate chairs with the ease of someone who had become a welcome guest rather than an investigating officer. "The criminal network that Queen Camilla became involved with has been completely dismantled. We've made arrests in Switzerland, Monaco, Austria, and France. Most importantly, we've recovered nearly 90% of the stolen artifacts from various sources." Morrison felt genuine satisfaction at this news. The scope of the investigation had ultimately revealed that Charlotte's accidental discovery had prevented one of the largest cultural thefts in modern history from reaching completion. "What will happen to all the recovered items now?" Charlotte asked. "They're being returned to their proper institutions," DCI Matthews explained. Many have already been restored to the royal collection, while others are going back to museums across Europe that had been victimized by similar operations. Your willingness to speak up has helped preserve cultural heritage for millions of people around the world. Charlotte considered this quietly for a moment. I never thought that telling you what I saw would help so many people. I was just worried about our family's things being stolen. That's what makes your actions so remarkable, DCI Matthews replied. You did the right thing without knowing how important it would become. That takes real character. As DCI Matthews prepared to leave, she turned to Morrison with a final piece of information. Sergeant Major, I thought you should know that Queen Camilla's legal team attempted to argue that she was coerced into participating in the conspiracy. However, the financial records and recorded conversations made it clear that she was a willing and active participant who was motivated primarily by greed rather than fear. This confirmation eliminated any lingering doubts about the justice of the outcome. While Morrison had struggled with the personal implications of investigating a member of the royal family, the evidence had ultimately made the moral dimensions clear. After DCI Matthews departed, Charlotte and Morrison continued their walk through the castle. They passed the blue drawing room, where Queen Victoria's portrait had been restored to its proper place, and Charlotte paused to study the painting that had played such a crucial role in her initial suspicions. You know, Sergeant Major, she said, I think Queen Victoria would be proud that we protected her things and made sure they stayed where they belong. Morrison smiled at Charlotte's ability to connect her actions with the broader historical legacy of the monarchy. I believe you're right, Your Highness. And I think she would be particularly proud of the courage you showed in standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult and frightening. As they reached the library for Charlotte's morning tutorials, Morrison reflected on the profound changes that had occurred over the past 6 months. The scandal had initially threatened to damage the monarchy's reputation, but the manner in which the royal family had cooperated fully with the investigation and supported Charlotte's testimony had ultimately strengthened public confidence in the institution. Charlotte had received thousands of letters from around the world, praising her courage and expressing gratitude for her role in preserving cultural heritage. While most of these communications were filtered through security protocols, a few were selected each week for Charlotte to read and respond to personally. I have one more question, Charlotte said as they settled into the library. Do you think I'll ever stop feeling sad about what happened with Granny Camilla? Morrison considered his response carefully, recognizing that this was perhaps the most important conversation they had ever had. I think the sadness you feel shows that you're a caring person who understands that even when people do very wrong things, they're still human beings who deserve some compassion. But I also think that as time passes, you'll find that the sadness becomes less sharp, and you'll be able to remember the good times you had with her while still understanding that what she did was serious and harmful. Charlotte nodded slowly. Mama says that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or pretending that wrong things didn't happen. It means choosing not to let the bad things control how you feel forever. Morrison was struck again by the wisdom that Charlotte continued to demonstrate. The events that had thrust her into the center of international headlines had tested her character in ways that few adults would ever face, and she had emerged with her essential kindness intact while gaining a mature understanding of moral complexity. As Professor Williams arrived to begin the day's lessons, Morrison positioned himself near the windows where he could maintain his protective oversight while allowing Charlotte the space to focus on her studies. The familiar routine of academic work provided stability and normalcy that helped balance the extraordinary experiences of the past year. During a break between lessons, Charlotte approached Morrison with a request that surprised him. Sergeant Major, I've been thinking about what I want to do when I'm older, and I'd like to learn more about how art authentication works. The experts who helped identify the forgeries in our collection, what they do seems very important. Morrison realized that Charlotte's experience had influenced her thinking about her future role and responsibilities. Rather than being traumatized by exposure to criminal behavior, she had developed a deeper appreciation for the importance of protecting cultural heritage and maintaining the integrity of important institutions. That's an excellent goal, Your Highness. Art authentication requires knowledge of history, chemistry, technology, and human psychology. It would be challenging but very rewarding work. Charlotte's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm that had driven her initial curiosity about the castle's hidden corners. Maybe someday I can help other people protect their important possessions, the way the investigators helped us get ours back. As the day continued with its mixture of formal lessons and informal conversations, Morrison found himself reflecting on the remarkable transformation he had witnessed. The curious 9-year-old who had first shared her concerns about unusual activities in Queen Camilla's quarters had evolved into a thoughtful young person who understood her unique position in the world and was already considering how she might use that position to serve others. The investigation that had begun with Charlotte's innocent observation had ultimately revealed and dismantled an international criminal conspiracy, recovered hundreds of millions of pounds worth of stolen cultural artifacts, and strengthened the monarchy's reputation for integrity and transparency. But, perhaps most importantly, it had demonstrated that courage and moral clarity could emerge from the most unexpected sources, and that even the youngest members of society could play crucial roles in protecting the institutions and values that bind communities together. As evening approached and Charlotte prepared to join her family for dinner, Morrison knew that their shared experience had forged a bond that would endure far beyond his current assignment. The brave little girl who had trusted him with her secret had taught him as much as he had protected her, and their partnership had helped ensure that Windsor Castle would continue to stand as a symbol of honor and tradition for generations to come. In the quiet moments before joining the family gathering, Charlotte looked out at the ancient grounds of Windsor Castle and smiled with the satisfaction of someone who understood that she had played a vital role in preserving something precious for the future. The secrets hidden in Queen Camilla's closet had been exposed to the light, justice had been served, and the castle stones could once again hold only the honorable secrets that befitted a place of such historical importance. The story that had begun with a child's curiosity and courage had ended with the restoration of trust and the preservation of treasures that belonged not just to one family, but to the entire world. The tension in the art studio was so thick it seemed to press against the ancient stone walls like a living thing. Charlotte's hand completed the signal, 2 deliberate touches to her left ear, and Morrison's world shifted into the heightened awareness that came with imminent danger. The hours following Queen Camilla's arrest transformed Windsor Castle from a symbol of royal tradition into the center of the most significant criminal investigation in modern British history. As news of the conspiracy spread through carefully controlled channels, the ancient fortress found itself swarming with forensic experts, art authentication specialists, and senior investigators from multiple law enforcement agencies. Princess Charlotte had been relocated to the secure family quarters in the East Wing, where she was reunited with her parents who had been urgently recalled from their official engagements. The Prince and Princess of Wales arrived by helicopter just as the sun began to set over the castle grounds, their faces grim with the weight of revelations that threatened to shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Morrison remained at Charlotte's side throughout the initial debriefing process, serving as both protector and witness to the extraordinary courage she continued to demonstrate. The interview room had been specially arranged to accommodate a child witness, with comfortable furniture and familiar objects from her own rooms to help maintain her sense of security. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Matthews, who led the Metropolitan Police's specialized unit for crimes against the Crown, conducted the formal interview with remarkable sensitivity to Charlotte's age while maintaining the thoroughness necessary for such a serious investigation. Princess Charlotte, DCI Matthews began, settling into a chair across from where Charlotte sat with her parents. I want you to know how helpful your observations have been. Can you tell me about the first moment you realized something unusual was happening in Queen Camilla's quarters? Charlotte glanced at her father, who nodded encouragingly. Prince William's jaw was set with controlled anger at the betrayal they had uncovered, but his voice remained gentle when he spoke to his daughter. Tell Inspector Matthews exactly what you told Sergeant Major Morrison, sweetheart. You've done nothing wrong, and everything you saw is important. Charlotte straightened in her chair with the composure that had been instilled in her from birth. It was the quietness that seemed wrong first. When people are doing normal work in the castle, they don't usually try to hide the sounds. But these people were moving very carefully, like they didn't want anyone to hear them. Morrison watched from his position near the door as Charlotte recounted her observations with remarkable precision. Her account included details that even trained investigators might have missed: the specific way the mysterious workers handled the artifacts, the manner in which they documented each item before replacement, and, most critically, the conversations she had overheard that revealed the international scope of the operation. You mentioned hearing Queen Camilla mention an audit, DCI Matthews continued. Can you remember any other specific words or phrases from that conversation? Charlotte closed her eyes briefly, clearly concentrating. She said something about the Swiss accounts and that everything needed to be cleaned before the investigators arrived next month. She also mentioned someone called Victor and said he was becoming impatient about the timeline. Morrison felt his estimation of Charlotte's observational skills increase yet again. The details she was providing were painting a picture of a sophisticated operation with international connections and a specific deadline tied to external oversight. DCI Matthews made careful notes while maintaining eye contact with Charlotte. "You've been incredibly helpful, Princess Charlotte. Is there anything else you remember seeing or hearing that seemed unusual?" "There is one more thing," Charlotte said, glancing toward her mother for reassurance. "When I was hiding and listening, I heard one of the men say something about the backup plan for if anyone discovered what they were doing. He said they had contingencies in place and that the little princess wouldn't be a problem for long." The room fell silent except for the scratching of DCI Matthews' pen. Princess Catherine reached over to squeeze her daughter's hand, while Prince William's expression darkened with protective fury. Morrison stepped forward slightly. "Your Highness, can you remember anything specific about the voice that made that threat? Any accent or distinguishing characteristics?" Charlotte considered carefully. "He had an accent that wasn't British. It sounded maybe European, but I'm not certain. And his voice was very cold, like he was talking about something that didn't matter very much." DCI Matthews finished her notes and looked up at the assembled group. "Princess Charlotte, you have provided crucial evidence that will help us understand the full scope of this conspiracy. You should be very proud of your bravery in reporting what you saw." As the formal interview concluded, Morrison's secure communication device buzzed with an update from the forensic teams working throughout the castle. The message was both vindication and revelation. Preliminary examination of South Wing quarters reveals sophisticated forgery operation. Conservative estimate suggests over 50 major artifacts replaced with high-quality reproductions over approximately 3-year period. The scale of the theft was staggering. If the initial estimates were accurate, the conspiracy had succeeded in stealing artifacts worth hundreds of millions of pounds from the royal collection, replacing them with forgeries so sophisticated that they had passed routine inspections and even casual expert examination. Prince William requested a private briefing from the lead investigators, and Morrison accompanied Charlotte to the family's private sitting room while the adults discussed the implications of what had been uncovered. Despite the gravity of the situation, Charlotte seemed more curious than frightened as she settled into her favorite reading chair. "Sergeant Major," she said, pulling a book from the side table, "will everything go back to normal now that we've caught them?" Morrison considered his response carefully. "Your Highness, what you helped uncover was very serious, and it will take time to sort everything out completely. But the most important thing is that you're safe, and the people responsible for this will face justice." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. "I keep thinking about all those beautiful things that were stolen. Some of them have been in our family for hundreds of years. It makes me sad to think that people would take them just to make money." The conversation was interrupted by the return of Charlotte's parents, accompanied by DCI Matthews and a man Morrison didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired, and carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of senior government authority. Prince William made the introductions. "Charlotte, this is Sir James Pemberton from the Cabinet Office. He's here to discuss some additional security measures that we need to put in place." Sir James approached Charlotte with the careful respect that senior officials typically reserved for much older members of the royal family. "Your Royal Highness, I wanted to personally thank you for your exceptional service to the Crown. What you have done requires remarkable courage, and I want to assure you that your safety remains our highest priority." Charlotte stood to acknowledge the introduction with proper protocol, but her response was pure 9-year-old curiosity. "Sir James, will you be able to get all the stolen things back?" Sir James exchanged glances with DCI Matthews before answering. "We're working with international law enforcement agencies to track down the stolen artifacts. Some have already been located in private collections in Switzerland and Monaco, just as you overheard. Recovery will take time, but we're confident that most of the items will eventually be returned." Morrison's earpiece crackled with another update. Second arrest made at Heathrow Airport. Subject matches description of Victor mentioned in Princess Charlotte's testimony. Attempting to board flight to Geneva with forged diplomatic passport. The investigation was moving with impressive speed, largely due to the detailed intelligence Charlotte had provided. Morrison realized that her accidental discovery had come at precisely the right moment to prevent the conspiracy from reaching completion. As evening settled over Windsor Castle, the family gathered for a private dinner that bore little resemblance to their usual formal meals. The dining room had been swept for listening devices as a precautionary measure, and additional security personnel maintained discreet positions throughout the East Wing. Charlotte ate with better appetite than she had shown in days, the relief of having the truth finally revealed clearly lifting a weight from her small shoulders. She asked thoughtful questions about the investigation process and listened with rapt attention as her father explained how the legal proceedings would unfold. "Will I have to testify in court?" she asked as dessert was served. Prince William considered the question seriously. "Possibly, sweetheart, but if you do, there are special procedures for children witnesses that will make sure you feel comfortable and safe. And Sergeant Major Morrison or one of us will be with you the entire time." Morrison felt honored by the family's continued trust, though he knew that the coming months would bring challenges that would test everyone involved in the case. The prosecution of Queen Camilla and her co-conspirators would be one of the most closely watched trials in British legal history. After dinner, as Charlotte prepared for bed under her mother's watchful supervision, Morrison received his most significant briefing of the day. DCI Matthews pulled him aside to share intelligence that had emerged from the interrogation of the suspects and examination of evidence seized from the castle. "The operation was even more sophisticated than we initially realized," she explained. "Queen Camilla wasn't the mastermind, she was essentially a high-level accomplice who provided access in exchange for substantial payments to offshore accounts. The real organizers are part of an international network that specializes in stealing and replacing cultural artifacts from major institutions." Morrison absorbed this information with professional interest, though part of his mind remained focused on the remarkable 9-year-old who had brought the entire conspiracy to light through her observational skills and moral courage. "What's particularly impressive," DCI Matthews continued, "is how accurately Princess Charlotte remembered the conversations she overheard. Her testimony is corroborating evidence we're finding in encrypted communications and financial records. Without her initial report, this operation might have continued for years without detection." As Morrison prepared for his own rest, the first real sleep he would get since Charlotte had first shared her concerns, he reflected on the extraordinary events that had transformed a routine protection assignment into one of the most significant investigations of his career. Charlotte had demonstrated that courage wasn't about the absence of fear, but about doing what was right despite being afraid. Her willingness to trust him with her observations had not only prevented massive cultural theft but had also protected the integrity of institutions that millions of people around the world viewed as symbols of stability and tradition. The investigation would continue for months, ultimately revealing connections to similar operations at museums and cultural institutions across Europe. But the moment that made it all possible was when a curious 9-year-old princess decided to explore parts of her home she hadn't seen before, and then had the wisdom and courage to speak up when she witnessed something that didn't seem right. As Windsor Castle settled into an uneasy quiet under unprecedented security, Morrison knew that the little girl sleeping peacefully in the East Wing had already earned her place in the secret history of those who had served the crown with exceptional distinction. Smile remained perfectly calibrated, but Morrison caught the subtle hardening around her eyes as she took another step closer to Charlotte's easel. The two men flanking her maintained positions that would allow them to block the studio's main entrance if necessary. "Charlotte," Camilla continued, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of decades in the public eye, "I've been thinking about how curious and observant you are. Sometimes curiosity can lead us to see things that might be easily misunderstood." Charlotte's paintbrush trembled slightly in her small hand, but her voice remained steady when she replied. "I don't understand what you mean, Granny Camilla." Morrison's earpiece crackled almost inaudibly with confirmation that backup was en route, but he estimated it would take at least 3 more minutes for additional security to reach their position. 3 minutes that might determine whether a 9-year-old princess would become the victim of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the royal household. Professor Williams, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrents of danger swirling around his art lesson, continued arranging supplies at the far end of the studio. Morrison realized that the elderly instructor's hearing difficulties, which typically required students to speak loudly during lessons, might actually provide some protection by making it difficult for him to overhear whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "Well, darling," Camilla said, settling into a chair across from Charlotte with practiced elegance, "I'm sure you understand that sometimes when we see adults doing things that might seem unusual, there are perfectly reasonable explanations that children might not immediately grasp." One of Camilla's companions moved slightly, and Morrison noticed a distinct bulge beneath his well-tailored jacket. The realization that these men might be armed transformed the situation from concerning to potentially lethal. Morrison's training had prepared him for many scenarios, but none had involved the possibility of a shootout in a castle art studio with a child caught in the crossfire. Charlotte set down her paintbrush and looked directly at Queen Camilla with a steadiness that belied her years. "Are you saying I saw something I shouldn't have seen?" The direct question seemed to catch Camilla off guard for just a moment, and, in that instant, Morrison saw something flicker across her face, a combination of calculation and genuine surprise at Charlotte's perceptiveness. "I'm saying, my dear, that sometimes little girls who spend too much time exploring places they shouldn't be might find themselves in situations that are far more complicated and dangerous than they realize." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Morrison's hand moved fractionally closer to his concealed weapon while his eyes scanned the room for anything that could provide cover or protection for Charlotte if the situation deteriorated rapidly. "Charlotte has always been encouraged to explore her home," Morrison interjected, his voice carefully neutral but carrying an undertone that any experienced operative would recognize as a warning. "Her parents believe that understanding the castle's history and operations is an important part of her education." Camilla's gaze shifted to Morrison for the first time since entering the studio, and he saw in her eyes a calculating intelligence that had been carefully hidden behind years of public smiles and charitable appearances. "Of course, Sergeant Major Morrison. We all want Charlotte to have the fullest possible understanding of her heritage. But surely you would agree that some aspects of royal life are too complex and sensitive for a child to fully comprehend." Morrison's earpiece delivered another quiet update. 2 minutes to arrival. Maintain position and avoid escalation if possible. The instruction to avoid escalation was sound tactical advice, but Morrison could see that Charlotte was beginning to understand the true nature of the threat she faced. Her natural intelligence and the maturity forced upon her by her royal birth were combining to help her grasp that she was in genuine danger from someone she had been taught to trust and respect. Professor Williams dropped a container of paintbrushes at the far end of the studio, the sudden clatter causing everyone to turn momentarily in his direction. Morrison seized the instant of distraction to catch Charlotte's eye and nod almost imperceptibly toward the studio's secondary exit, a door that led to a narrow corridor originally designed as a servant's passage. Charlotte understood immediately. Morrison had spent months drilling emergency procedures with all the royal children, and the protocols for unexpected threats were deeply ingrained in their training. She began casually cleaning her brushes, moving slightly closer to the secondary exit while maintaining the appearance of normal activity. "You know, Granny Camilla," Charlotte said, her voice carrying an innocence that Morrison recognized as calculated, "yesterday when I was walking past your rooms, I was thinking about how beautiful all the artwork is throughout the castle. Papa has been teaching us about the history of different pieces in the royal collection." Camilla's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "And what have you learned about the collection, darling?" "That every piece has been carefully catalogued and that there are experts who make sure everything stays exactly where it's supposed to be. Papa says that's very important because the collection belongs not just to our family, but to the entire nation." Morrison felt a surge of admiration for Charlotte's courage and intelligence. She was essentially challenging the conspirators while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation, forcing them to reveal more about their intentions while buying time for backup to arrive. "That's quite right," Camilla replied, but Morrison could hear the strain in her voice. "The collection is indeed very carefully managed. Sometimes that management involves moving pieces temporarily for cleaning, restoration, or security purposes." "Is that what was happening yesterday? Were the people I saw helping with restoration work?" The direct question hung in the air like a blade. Morrison could see Camilla calculating her response while her two companions grew visibly tense. Whatever cover story they had prepared was clearly inadequate to deal with a 9-year-old who possessed both intelligence and courage in equal measure. "Charlotte," Camilla said, her voice losing some of its warmth, "I think it would be best if you focused on your art lesson and left questions about collection management to the adults who are responsible for such matters." Morrison's earpiece crackled with the message he had been waiting for, back up in position. "Ready to engage on your signal." The moment of truth had arrived. Morrison could allow the conversation to continue and hope that Camilla would retreat without escalating the situation, or he could act on the clear threat that had been made against Charlotte and bring the conspiracy into the open. Either choice carried enormous risks, but his oath was to protect the royal family, not to protect the monarchy from scandal. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison said formally, addressing Camilla with the protocol that underscored the gravity of what was happening, "I believe this conversation has reached a point where it would be appropriate for Princess Charlotte to rejoin her family." Camilla's mask finally slipped completely. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Sergeant Major. Charlotte and I have more to discuss, and it would be best if that discussion took place without interruption." One of her companions moved closer to the main entrance, confirming Morrison's assessment that they had intended all along to prevent Charlotte from leaving. The conspiracy had moved beyond theft into kidnapping, and Morrison's duty was now crystal clear. He touched his earpiece and spoke a single word: execute. The studio's main door burst open as 3 armed security specialists entered with precision timing. Simultaneously, Morrison swept Charlotte behind the protective bulk of a heavy oak table while drawing his weapon. "Armed police," the lead specialist shouted. "Everyone remain still and keep your hands visible." Camilla's face showed shock and outrage in equal measure. "How dare you? Do you have any idea what you're doing? I am the Queen Consort. And you are under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to commit theft, fraud, and threatening a member of the royal family," the lead specialist replied with professional calm. Charlotte crouched behind the table with Morrison, her eyes wide but her composure intact. "Sergeant Major," she whispered, "does this mean Granny Camilla was really stealing things?" "It means that we're going to find out the truth about everything you saw," Morrison replied. "And it means that you were very brave to tell me about it." Professor Williams, finally, grasping that his art lesson had been interrupted by something far more serious than a family disagreement, retreated to the far corner of the studio and began frantically packing his supplies. As Camilla and her companions were searched and restrained, Morrison's communication device buzzed with updates from teams throughout the castle. "South Wing secured. Significant evidence of art forgery operation discovered. Multiple artifacts in various stages of replacement." The full scope of what Charlotte had accidentally uncovered was beginning to emerge. What had started as a child's innocent observation had revealed what appeared to be a years-long conspiracy to systematically steal and replace priceless artifacts from the royal collection. "Sergeant Major Morrison," the lead specialist called out, "we need Princess Charlotte to provide a formal statement about what she witnessed." "Is she ready for that?" Morrison looked down at Charlotte, who was still crouched beside him but now watching the proceedings with fascination rather than fear. "Your Highness, are you ready to tell the officers exactly what you saw yesterday?" Charlotte stood up with the dignity that had been bred into her over 9 generations of royal lineage. "Yes, I'm ready. But first, can someone please check on the painting of Queen Victoria in the blue drawing room? If the woman I saw yesterday was wearing Victoria's brooch, then I think they might have taken other things too." Morrison felt a surge of pride as Charlotte took control of the situation with the same courage and intelligence that had brought them to this moment. The little girl who had trusted him with her secret was proving herself capable of facing the consequences of that trust with remarkable grace. As they prepared to leave the studio, Morrison realized that Charlotte had learned something that day that went far beyond the art lessons Professor Williams had planned to teach. She had learned that sometimes the greatest courage is required not to face strangers in the dark, but to stand up to people you are supposed to trust when you know they are doing something wrong. The investigation that would follow would eventually reveal the full extent of the conspiracy and the international network of criminals who had exploited Queen Camilla's position for their own gain. But the moment that had made that investigation possible was when a 9-year-old princess decided to trust the one person whose job it was to protect her, regardless of the consequences. As they walked toward the door, Charlotte slipped her small hand into Morrison's much larger one. "Thank you for believing me," she said quietly. "Thank you for trusting me," he replied, and meant every word. The morning after Morrison sent his coded message brought an unseasonable chill to Windsor Castle. Frost clung to the windows of the ancient fortress, and the heating system struggled against the penetrating cold that seemed to seep through the very stones. Morrison arrived for duty an hour earlier than usual, hoping to gather more intelligence before Charlotte began her daily routine. His secure device had buzzed twice during the night with brief confirmations that his message had been received and that additional resources were being quietly deployed. By dawn, 3 additional security specialists had been positioned around the castle under the cover of routine maintenance inspections. Charlotte appeared for their morning walk looking pale and drawn. Dark circles under her eyes suggested that sleep had been elusive, and Morrison noted that her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her school blazer. "Did you have trouble sleeping, Your Highness?" he asked gently as they began their familiar route through the long walk corridor. "I kept having strange dreams," she admitted. "Dreams about people taking things that didn't belong to them, and about getting lost in parts of the castle I'd never seen before." Morrison understood that children often process traumatic experiences through their subconscious minds, and Charlotte's dreams likely reflected her anxiety about what she had witnessed. He made a mental note to recommend counseling support once the immediate situation was resolved. "Your Highness, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I believe it would be helpful if you could provide me with more specific details about what you observed. Sometimes the smallest details can be the most important." Charlotte glanced around nervously before responding. "There was something else I noticed but didn't mention yesterday. One of the men handling the artifacts had a very distinctive tattoo on his wrist, a compass rose with what looked like coordinates underneath. And the woman who seemed to be in charge was wearing a brooch that I recognized." "Recognized from where?" "From a painting in the royal collection. It's a piece that supposedly belonged to Queen Victoria, but seeing it on that woman made me wonder if the original is still where it's supposed to be." Morrison felt his heart rate accelerate. If Charlotte was correct, then the scope of the operation was far larger than he had initially imagined. The systematic theft or replacement of artifacts from the royal collection would constitute one of the most audacious crimes in British history. As they approached the breakfast room, Morrison's earpiece crackled with a low-priority message from his supervisor. "Status report requested on South Wing security sweep. Any unusual findings?" The timing of the inquiry struck Morrison as suspicious. Either it was an unfortunate coincidence, or someone within the security hierarchy was fishing for information about his activities. He responded with a carefully neutral acknowledgement that he would provide a full report later in the day. During Charlotte's breakfast, Morrison noticed several subtle changes in the castle's daily operations. Staff members seemed to be moving with unusual urgency, and there were more whispered conversations in corridors than was typical. Most concerning, he observed 2 individuals in expensive business attire being escorted toward Queen Camilla's quarters by a member of her personal staff. Charlotte caught his eye and touched her left ear once, not quite the full signal, but clearly a message that she was feeling anxious. Morrison responded with a barely perceptible nod and adjusted his position to maintain better sightlines throughout the breakfast room. When Charlotte excused herself to visit the powder room, Morrison took the opportunity to activate a listening device that his additional backup had provided. The sophisticated equipment could pick up conversations through the castle's ancient walls, though the stone construction and modern security measures made such surveillance challenging. What he heard through his earpiece made his blood run cold. Queen Camilla's voice was clearly audible as she spoke with someone in her private sitting room. "The timeline has been moved up," she was saying. "We need to complete the remaining substitutions within the next 48 hours. The child has already seen too much, and we can't afford to have her stumbling across anything else." A male voice responded, though Morrison couldn't quite make out the words. Camilla's reply was crystal clear: "I don't care how difficult it is. We're too close to completion to let a curious 9-year-old destroy everything we've worked for. Take whatever measures are necessary to ensure she doesn't interfere." Morrison's protective instincts surged into overdrive. The conversation he had just overheard constituted a direct threat against Princess Charlotte, and his duty was now clear regardless of the political implications. He immediately activated an emergency protocol that would bring additional security resources to the castle within the hour. When Charlotte returned from the powder room, Morrison could see that her anxiety had intensified. She was biting her lower lip and fidgeting with her napkin in a way that suggested she was barely maintaining her composure. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "I think it would be best if we modified your schedule for today. Perhaps we could arrange for your tutoring sessions to take place in the library rather than in your usual study room." The library was located in the north wing, as far as possible from Queen Camilla's quarters, and it had multiple exit routes should a rapid evacuation become necessary. Charlotte nodded her agreement, seeming relieved that someone was taking charge of the situation. As they made their way toward the library, Morrison's earpiece buzzed with an incoming message from his backup team. 3 additional individuals observed entering South Wing. Vehicle registration indicates rental from London-based company with connections to international art dealers. The pieces of the conspiracy were falling into place with frightening clarity. What had begun as Charlotte's innocent observation was revealing itself to be an elaborate international operation involving the systematic theft and replacement of priceless royal artifacts. The involvement of Queen Camilla elevated the situation from serious crime to potential treason. In the library, surrounded by centuries of accumulated royal knowledge and wisdom, Morrison positioned himself where he could observe all entrances while Charlotte settled into her studies with Miss Henderson, who had recovered from her family emergency. The familiar routine of academic work seemed to calm Charlotte somewhat, though Morrison noticed she continued to glance toward the windows overlooking the south wing. During the mid-morning break, Morrison's secure communication device received a priority message that changed everything. External surveillance has identified international courier service making scheduled pickups from service entrance. Customs documents indicate shipments to private collectors in Switzerland and Monaco. The revelation that stolen royal artifacts were being shipped out of the country added urgency to an already explosive situation. Morrison realized that they were likely witnessing the final phases of an operation that had been years in the making, and that Charlotte's accidental discovery might be the only thing standing between the conspirators and their successful completion of one of history's most audacious heists. As lunchtime approached, Morrison made a decision that he knew would irrevocably alter his relationship with the royal household. He activated his highest priority communication protocol and sent a direct message to the Metropolitan Police's specialized unit that handled crimes against the crown. Request immediate assistance at Windsor Castle. Ongoing theft of royal artifacts involving high-level palace personnel. Princess Charlotte witnessed criminal activity and may be at risk. Coordinate response with Palace Security Chief Davidson and approach with maximum discretion. The response came back within minutes. Unit deployed. Maintain current position and ensure subjects' safety. Do not engage suspects until backup arrives. Charlotte finished her morning tutorials and looked up at Morrison with eyes that held a maturity far beyond her 9 years. "Something big is happening, isn't it? I can see it in your face." Morrison crouched down to meet her eye level, a gesture that had become their signal for serious conversation. "Your Highness, what you witnessed yesterday was very serious, and there are people working right now to make sure that justice is served. But I need you to be very brave and very careful for the rest of today." "Are we in danger?" The direct question deserved an honest answer. "There might be some people who would prefer that you hadn't seen what you saw. But you're surrounded by people whose only job is to keep you safe, and we're very good at our jobs." Charlotte's face showed a flicker of fear, but also a determination that reminded Morrison of her grandfather, the late Prince Philip, who had faced countless challenges throughout his long life with unflinching courage. "What should I do?" "Continue with your normal routine as much as possible, but stay close to me or to other people you trust completely. If anyone you don't recognize tries to talk to you about anything other than normal palace business, use our signal immediately." As they prepared to head to the dining room for lunch, Morrison's earpiece crackled with updates from his backup team. South Wing activity has intensified. Additional vehicles observed, and thermal imaging suggests significant movement within Queen Camilla's quarters. The timing suggested that the conspirators were indeed accelerating their timeline, possibly because they suspected that their activities had been detected. Morrison realized that the next few hours would likely determine whether they could preserve the evidence necessary to prosecute what appeared to be an international conspiracy of staggering proportions. Lunch was served in the smaller family dining room, where Charlotte typically ate with her siblings when they were in residence. Today, however, her brothers were at school, leaving her as the sole child present. Morrison noted the absence of several staff members who normally would have been present, and he began to suspect that the conspiracy extended further into the palace hierarchy than he had initially imagined. During the meal, Charlotte ate sparingly and kept glancing toward Morrison with questions in her eyes that she couldn't voice in the presence of other staff members. He tried to project calm confidence while remaining alert for any signs of threat. The afternoon brought new developments that would test everyone's courage and resolve. As Charlotte settled into her art lesson with Professor Williams in the castle's studio, Morrison received a message that made his blood run cold. Subject approaching North Wing with 2 unidentified associates. Recommend immediate relocation of primary target. Morrison looked up to see Queen Camilla approaching the studio, flanked by 2 men he didn't recognize. Her expression was pleasant but determined, and Morrison's training told him that this was not a casual visit. He touched his earpiece and spoke quietly, "Request immediate backup at North Wing Studio. Potential confrontation imminent." As Queen Camilla entered the studio with her companions, Morrison moved closer to Charlotte while maintaining the appearance of casual alertness. The art lesson continued, with Professor Williams seemingly unaware of the tension that had suddenly filled the room. "Charlotte, darling," Queen Camilla said in her characteristic warm tone, "I was hoping we might have a little chat about your recent explorations around the castle. I understand you've been quite the little adventurer lately." Charlotte looked up from her watercolor painting, and Morrison saw her hand move almost imperceptibly toward her left ear. The motion was subtle enough that only someone watching for it would have noticed, but to Morrison it was as clear as an alarm bell. The moment of truth had arrived. Everything that had begun with a child's innocent curiosity was about to culminate in a confrontation that would either expose one of the most elaborate criminal conspiracies in royal history or destroy the life and career of everyone involved in its investigation. Morrison's hand moved to his communication device, ready to call for immediate assistance, while his eyes remained fixed on Charlotte's face. The brave little girl who had trusted him with her secret was about to face the most dangerous moment of her young life, and everything that happened next would determine whether justice would prevail or whether the ancient walls of Windsor Castle would continue to hide secrets that could shake the monarchy to its foundations. Die in the shadowed corridors of Windsor Castle, where secrets whisper through ancient stones and tradition masks the truth, a 9-year-old princess discovers something so shocking about her step-grandmother that she dares not speak it aloud. Instead, she uses a code known only to her most trusted protector, a signal that will shatter the carefully constructed facade of royal perfection and expose the darkness hidden behind palace doors. The morning mist clung to the ancient walls of Windsor Castle like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the fortress that had stood sentinel over English royalty for nearly 1,000 years. Sergeant Major James Morrison adjusted his red tunic and checked his timepiece for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. 23 years of service to the crown had taught him that punctuality was not merely expected, it was sacred. At precisely 7:30, the familiar sound of small feet echoed through the long walk corridor. Princess Charlotte emerged from the shadows, her school uniform pristine despite the early hour. Her auburn hair caught the weak morning light filtering through the tall windows, and her green eyes held that peculiar mixture of innocence and wisdom that seemed to characterize all the Windsor children. "Good morning, Sergeant Major," she said, offering the slight curtsy that protocol demanded, though her smile suggested genuine affection rather than mere duty. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Morrison replied, falling into step beside her as they began their daily walk to the breakfast room. This routine had developed naturally over the past year, ever since Charlotte had expressed discomfort with the formal escort procedures. Her parents, the Prince and Princess of Wales, had agreed that a more casual arrangement might better serve their daughter's emotional well-being. Charlotte walked with unusual quietness this morning, her typical chatter about school projects and friend dramas notably absent. Morrison had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when something troubled the young princess. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, and she kept glancing toward the windows overlooking the East Terrace gardens. "Penny for your thoughts, Your Highness?" Morrison ventured, using the informal phrase that had become something of a tradition between them. Charlotte paused near one of the ancient suits of armor that lined the corridor. Her small hand traced the edge of a display case containing medieval weapons, and Morrison noticed how her fingers trembled slightly. "Sergeant Major," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "what would you do if you saw something that you weren't supposed to see? Something that might be wrong, but you're not entirely sure?" The question struck Morrison as unusually mature for a 9-year-old, even one raised in the rarefied atmosphere of royal life. He crouched down to meet her eye level, a gesture that always made their conversations feel more intimate and less formal. "Well, Your Highness, that would depend on what kind of thing we're talking about. Sometimes our eyes can play tricks on us, especially when we're worried or upset about something else entirely." Charlotte's green eyes searched his face with an intensity that made Morrison slightly uncomfortable. In his decades of service, he had learned to recognize when members of the royal family were genuinely distressed versus merely dealing with the ordinary pressures of their extraordinary lives. What if it involved someone we're supposed to respect? Someone who's supposed to be setting a good example? The specificity of her question raised alarm bells in Morrison's mind. His training had taught him to be alert for signs of inappropriate behavior around the children, and, while he had never witnessed anything concerning, he also knew that predators often operated in shadows that even the most vigilant protection could not always illuminate. "Charlotte," he said, using her given name rather than her title, which always signaled that he was speaking to her as a person rather than a position, "if you've seen something that makes you uncomfortable, or if someone has done something that doesn't feel right, you need to tell me about it. That's what I'm here for." She bit her lower lip, a nervous habit she had inherited from her mother. The morning light streaming through the windows cast long shadows across her face, making her appear older than her years. "It's about Granny Camilla," she whispered, glancing around to ensure they were truly alone. "Yesterday afternoon, I was supposed to be in my tutoring session with Miss Henderson, but she had to cancel because her mother was ill. Instead of going back to my room, I decided to explore the south wing. You know how Papa always says we should know every corner of our home?" Morrison nodded, though a growing sense of unease was settling in his stomach like a cold stone. "I was walking past Granny Camilla's private quarters when I heard strange noises coming from her sitting room. Not bad noises exactly, but different. Like people moving furniture around, but very quietly, as if they didn't want anyone to hear." Charlotte paused, clearly struggling with how to articulate what she had experienced. Morrison waited patiently, knowing that rushing her would likely cause her to retreat into herself. The door to her sitting room was slightly open, which was strange because it's usually closed when she's not receiving visitors. "I know I shouldn't have looked, but curiosity got the better of me." She glanced up at Morrison, seeking reassurance that she wouldn't be punished for her natural inquisitiveness. He offered an encouraging nod. "What I saw didn't make sense at first. There were several people I didn't recognize, not staff members, not security, not anyone I had ever seen around the castle before. They were well dressed, like business people, but they were handling things from Granny Camilla's personal collection. Expensive things. Jewelry, artwork, even some of the small furniture pieces that have been in the family for generations." Morrison's training kicked into high alert. What Charlotte was describing sounded like either a very sophisticated theft operation or something equally concerning that involved the Queen Consort's cooperation. Were they taking these items away, or were they bringing new ones in? "That's what made it so confusing," Charlotte replied. "They seemed to be doing both. Some items were being carefully wrapped and placed in special cases, while others were being unwrapped and positioned exactly where the other items had been. It was like they were replacing things." The implications of what Charlotte was describing began to crystallize in Morrison's mind. Art forgery, insurance fraud, or worse, the systematic replacement of priceless royal artifacts with replicas for personal gain. Any of these scenarios would constitute a massive scandal that could rock the monarchy to its foundations. "Did you see Queen Camilla during any of this?" Charlotte shook her head. "No, but I heard her voice coming from what I think was her bedroom. She was on the telephone, speaking in a very quiet voice. I couldn't make out most of what she was saying, but I distinctly heard her mention something about the deadline and making sure everything is in place before the audit." Morrison felt his mouth go dry. Royal finances were subject to periodic audits by both internal and external oversight bodies. If someone was systematically replacing royal artifacts with forgeries in advance of such an audit, it suggested a level of premeditation and sophistication that was deeply troubling. Your Highness, this is very serious information you shared with me. I need you to understand that what you witnessed might be part of something much larger and more complex than we can handle on our own. Charlotte's face paled slightly. Am I in trouble for seeing it? Absolutely not, Morrison assured her firmly. You've done exactly the right thing by telling me about it. But now we need to be very careful about how we proceed. We can't let anyone know that you've shared this information with me, at least not until we understand better what's happening. They resumed walking toward the breakfast room, but Morrison's mind was racing through protocols and procedures. His loyalty was ultimately to the crown and to the safety of the royal family, but the situation Charlotte had described put him in an extraordinarily delicate position. Sergeant Major, Charlotte said as they approached the ornate doors of the breakfast room, there's something else. Morrison stopped walking. What is it? When I was listening outside the sitting room, I heard one of the strangers mention my name. He said something about making sure that the little princess doesn't stumble across anything she shouldn't see. It made me feel scared, like maybe I was already in some kind of danger. The protective instincts that had been honed through 2 decades of military service and 3 years of royal protection detail surged through Morrison's system like an electric current. If Charlotte was right about what she had overheard, then her safety might indeed be at risk. Your Highness, I need you to listen to me very carefully. For the next few days, I want you to stay close to your regular routine and your usual companions. Don't go exploring alone, especially not in the South Wing. If anyone you don't recognize approaches you or asks you questions about what you might have seen around the castle, you tell them politely that you need to speak with your parents first. Charlotte nodded solemnly. Should I tell Mama and Papa about what I saw? Morrison considered this carefully. The Prince and Princess of Wales would need to be informed eventually, but he wanted to gather more information first. Accusations against the Queen Consort would require absolute certainty and ironclad evidence. Not yet, he said finally. Give me a day or two to look into this discreetly. But, Charlotte, if anything else happens, anything at all that makes you feel uncomfortable or unsafe, I want you to use our special signal. The special signal had been established 6 months earlier, after a security scare involving a photographer who had managed to breach the castle grounds. Charlotte was to touch her left ear twice if she felt threatened or needed immediate assistance, regardless of the social situation or protocol considerations. I understand, Charlotte said, demonstrating the signal quickly and discreetly. As they entered the breakfast room, where the familiar sounds of morning preparations created a comforting backdrop of normalcy, Morrison's mind was already formulating a plan. He would need to conduct surveillance on Queen Camilla's quarters without raising suspicion, which would require careful coordination with trusted members of the security team. The breakfast room was elegant but intimate, designed to accommodate family meals rather than state functions. Morning light streamed through tall windows that overlooked the rose gardens, and the air carried the scent of fresh bread and coffee. Charlotte took her usual seat at the smaller table reserved for the children when they weren't eating with their parents. Morrison positioned himself near the windows, maintaining his protective stance while appearing relaxed and casual. From this vantage point, he could observe both the entrances to the room and the grounds beyond, while keeping Charlotte within easy reach. As Charlotte began eating her breakfast, Morrison noticed that she kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone unwelcome to appear. Her appetite seemed diminished, and she pushed her food around her plate more than she actually consumed it. The morning routine continued with tutoring sessions and scheduled activities, but Morrison found himself analyzing every person who came into contact with Charlotte throughout the day. He began to notice things he had previously overlooked. Certain staff members seemed unusually interested in Charlotte's whereabouts, and there were several individuals he didn't recognize who appeared to be conducting business in areas of the castle where they had no obvious purpose. During Charlotte's writing lesson in the afternoon, Morrison took the opportunity to conduct a preliminary reconnaissance of the South Wing. The corridors were quieter than usual, and he was able to position himself where he could observe the approach to Queen Camilla's quarters without being detected. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. A steady stream of well-dressed individuals was indeed entering and leaving the Queen Consort's private rooms, each carrying carefully wrapped packages. The level of organization and the obvious expense of the operation suggested that whatever was happening had been planned for months, possibly years. Morrison's secure communication device buzzed with a message from his supervisor requesting a routine status update. As he prepared his response, he realized that he was facing one of the most difficult decisions of his career. Protocol demanded that he report any suspicious activity immediately through proper channels, but those same channels might be compromised if the conspiracy reached high enough levels within the royal household. As evening approached and Charlotte prepared for dinner with her family, Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He activated a special protocol that he had hoped never to use, a direct communication line to a select group of senior security officials who operated outside the normal palace hierarchy. The message he sent was brief but urgent: potential security threat involving royal assets. Request immediate but discreet backup for enhanced monitoring of South Wing activities. Princess Charlotte may have witnessed criminal activity. Recommend elevated protection status effective immediately. As he watched Charlotte join her family for dinner, appearing to all outward observers like a typical 9-year-old princess enjoying a quiet evening at home, Morrison knew that they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The innocence that had characterized Charlotte's sheltered royal existence was about to collide with the harsh realities of power, greed, and betrayal that existed even within the ancient walls of Windsor Castle. The investigation that was about to unfold would test not only Morrison's skills as a protector but also Charlotte's courage as a witness to something that threatened the very foundations of the institution she had been born to serve. Neither of them could have imagined how deep the conspiracy would prove to run, or how many lives would be forever changed by the secrets hidden in Queen Camilla's closet.